They were going to erase her. Rebecca Carter felt the cold steel of the cuffs bite into her wrists as two guards dragged her down the dimly lit hallway. Her ribs ached from the last lesson Sergeant Holloway had delivered. Blood, hers or someone else's, she wasn't sure, stained the collar of her prison jumpsuit. She kept her breathing steady. Show no weakness. Give them nothing. The air inside the maximum security wing was thick, suffocating. This wasn't just another transfer. The usual protocol was missing. No paperwork, no other inmates in sight. The farther they went, the more she understood. This wasn't a transfer. This was an execution without a bullet. The door at the end of the hall loomed ahead, reinforced steel with no window. A place no one came back from. Holloway walked beside her, his smirk carved deep into his face. "I have to admit, Carter, I thought you'd break by now." Rebecca ignored him. "That whole Navy SEAL thing," he continued, voice dripping with amusement, impressive on paper. "But here, it doesn't mean shit." She felt the zip ties tighten around her wrists as the guards pulled her forward. They thought this was the end of her story. They had no idea she was just getting started. The door swung open. Darkness waited inside. Then they shoved her in, and the world disappeared. Stick around till the end to witness karma in action. And if you enjoy seeing justice delivered, don't forget to like, leave a comment, and tell me where you're tuning in from. What if everything you believed about the justice system was a lie? What if those sworn to protect you were the ones pulling the strings, twisting the truth to suit their own agenda? It all started with a simple walk home. A late-night breeze rustled the leaves along the quiet street as Rebecca checked her phone for directions. She had just finished meeting an old friend, one of the few she still kept in touch with from her time in service. The city was different at night, quieter, but not necessarily safer. Then came the headlights. A patrol car pulled up beside her, tires crunching against the pavement. Officer Jake Simmons stepped out, his badge gleaming under the street lamp. Rebecca knew the look in his eyes before he even spoke. "You mind telling me what you're doing here?" His tone was casual, but Rebecca sensed the underlying hostility. She had spent too many years reading body language, understanding threats before they fully materialized. "I'm heading home," she replied evenly. "Can I see some ID?" Rebecca hesitated. She knew her rights, knew that standing on a sidewalk wasn't a crime. "Have I done something wrong?" Simmons' expression darkened. "Just show me some ID, ma'am." She could have complied. Maybe that would have ended it. But she also knew that blind compliance was exactly what men like Simmons thrived on. "Not until you tell me why you're asking." A flicker of irritation crossed his face. Then, before she could react, he grabbed her wrist. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Rebecca's instincts kicked in. Years of training surged through her veins, telling her to break his grip, disarm him, neutralize the threat. But she forced herself to remain still. She knew how this would look. A black woman resisting a white cop? The headlines would write themselves. "I'm not resisting," she said calmly. "Let go of my arm." Instead, Simmons shoved her against the hood of the patrol car. The impact sent a jolt through her ribs, but she refused to show weakness. "You just assaulted an officer," he sneered, "and you're under arrest." Rebecca's blood ran cold. She had walked into a trap, and now the real fight was about to begin. The cold steel of the handcuffs bit into Rebecca's wrists as she sat in the back of the squad car, staring out at the flashing city. Lights. This wasn't just a routine arrest. Simmons had a plan, and she needed to figure out what it was before it was too late. At the precinct, they processed her like any other suspect. Fingerprints, mugshot, the whole procedure designed to strip her of her identity. But Rebecca wasn't just any suspect. She was Lieutenant Commander Rebecca Carter, a decorated Navy SEAL. And she wasn't going down without a fight. The interrogation room was dimly lit, the air thick with the stench of coffee and sweat. Across the table, Simmons leaned back in his chair, smug and overconfident. "Tell me, Carter," he mused, flipping through her file. "What's a former SEAL doing causing trouble in my city?" Rebecca held his gaze. "I didn't cause trouble. You did." Simmons chuckled. That's cute. But here's the thing. You're just another face in the system now. And once we get a conviction, you'll be locked away where no one will care who you used to be. She knew what he was trying to do. Break her. Make her feel powerless. But Rebecca had endured worse interrogations at the hands of foreign enemies. A corrupt cop was nothing compared to that. Then the door opened, and in walked her appointed defense attorney, Daniel Hayes. Young, eager, and clearly in over his head. "Ms. Carter, I'll be representing you," he said, his voice uncertain. Rebecca studied him. He was fresh out of law school, probably given her case because no one else wanted it. "Great," she muttered. "We're off to a fantastic start." Daniel shuffled his papers. "They're charging you with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer." Rebecca exhaled sharply. "I didn't touch him." Daniel hesitated before leaning in. Then why did his body cam footage conveniently malfunction? Her heart rate spiked. Of course it had. That was step one of the cover-up. But she had spent years playing chess with enemies far more dangerous than Simmons. If he thought she was just another victim, he was in for a rude awakening. "We're going to fight this," Daniel said, though his voice lacked conviction. Rebecca smirked. "Oh, we're not just going to fight it." She leaned forward, her voice lowering to a dangerous whisper. "We're going to burn their entire house of lies to the ground." Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office across town, Judge Robert Ellis poured himself a glass of whiskey. His phone buzzed. A message flashed across the screen. "It's done. She's in custody." Ellis exhaled slowly, taking a sip of his drink. "Good," he murmured to himself. "Now let's make sure she never gets out." In the darkness of her holding cell, Rebecca stared at the ceiling, mind racing. She was up against an entire system built to bury people like her. But what they didn't know was that she wasn't just anyone. She was prepared, and the truth was coming for them all. The clang of the metal bars echoed through the dimly lit holding cell as Rebecca Carter leaned against the cold, hard bench. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, disinfectant, and something more insidious: hopelessness. She had been in many tight spots before, under enemy fire in foreign lands, but there was something uniquely suffocating about being trapped in a system designed to break people like her. She closed her eyes, steadying her breathing. Losing control wasn't an option. The moment she let her anger dictate her actions, she'd become exactly what they wanted her to be: a hostile, defiant black woman, an angry criminal. The door creaked open. "On your feet, Carter," barked the officer, standing at the threshold. He was a stocky man, mid-40s, with thinning hair and the look of someone who had spent his career thriving on power over others. His nameplate read Sergeant Holloway. Rebecca didn't move immediately. She met his gaze, reading him the way she'd been trained to: calculating, assessing, measuring. He wanted her to react. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. "You've got a long night ahead," Holloway sneered. "Better get used to it." He grabbed her by the arm, squeezing tighter than necessary as he led her down a poorly lit corridor. Rebecca let him have his show of dominance. It didn't matter. Not yet. The processing room was even colder than the holding cell. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow over the space. Holloway shoved Rebecca into a chair, and another officer, a younger man named Officer Tate, positioned himself in front of her. He was different from Holloway, less smug, more hesitant, like someone still deciding how much of his humanity he was willing to sacrifice for the job. "You know, Carter," Holloway said, circling her like a predator, "you Navy types think you're untouchable. But in here, you're just another criminal." Rebecca smirked. "Funny. I was thinking the same thing about cops." Holloway's eyes darkened, and before she could brace for it, his fist slammed onto the metal table in front of her. The noise reverberated through the room. "Watch your mouth," he growled. Tate flinched, but said nothing. Rebecca didn't react. She had endured worse, much worse. "You want to tell us why you were resisting arrest?" Tate finally spoke up, his voice neutral. Rebecca turned her attention to him, measuring her response carefully. "I wasn't." Officer Simmons tells a different story. Holloway interjected, crossing his arms. Says you were belligerent, tried to take his weapon. Rebecca let out a dry laugh. Is that what he said? Holloway leaned in. And I suppose you have a different version? Rebecca met his gaze without blinking. The truth. Silence stretched between them before Holloway snorted. You keep telling yourself that. He motioned to Tate. Book her. By the time Rebecca was led back to her cell, exhaustion was setting in. Not just physical, but the kind of bone-deep weariness that came from years of fighting battles she shouldn't have had to fight. She sat on the cot, rolling her shoulders, breathing in the damp air. Across from her, another woman watched her warily. First time, the woman asked. She was older, mid-50s, with tired eyes that had seen too much. Rebecca didn't answer. The woman nodded knowingly. I'm Linda, by the way. Rebecca gave a slight nod in return. Linda leaned forward. You must have pissed someone off real bad to end up here like this. Rebecca exhaled. Seems that way. Linda studied her for a long moment. You ain't gonna find justice in here, honey. The sooner you learn that, the better. Rebecca held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. Maybe justice wasn't in here. But the truth? That was a different story. And Rebecca Carter wasn't done fighting. Meanwhile, in a dimly lit office miles away, Judge Robert Ellis sat behind his mahogany desk, staring at the latest message on his phone. She's not breaking. What do you want us to do next? Ellis took a slow sip of whiskey before responding. Apply more pressure. She'll crack eventually. Rebecca Carter woke to the sound of heavy boots echoing down the corridor. The fluorescent light above her cell buzzed, flickering every few seconds. Sleep had been a luxury she couldn't afford. Between the cold, the discomfort, and the constant paranoia of what was coming next, she had spent most of the night lying awake, listening. The jail had its own rhythm. The murmurs of other inmates, the occasional clatter of a food tray, and the distinct sound of officers laughing at some joke meant only for them. She had heard them, heard how they talked about her when they thought she wasn't listening. Let's see how tough the SEAL really is. She thinks she's special? She's just another one of them. Simmons said she gave him attitude. She deserves whatever's coming. Now, the footsteps stopped right outside her cell. Sergeant Holloway was back. His smirk was the same, but there was something else in his expression today. Anticipation. Rise and shine, Carter, he said, tapping his baton against the bars. You've got company. Rebecca sat up but didn't immediately move. She knew better than to rush to their orders. That's what they wanted, to control every aspect of her, to make her dance on their terms. Holloway's smirk widened. Not in the mood? Well, lucky for you. I've got just the thing to fix that. He unlocked the cell and motioned for her to step out. Rebecca did, careful not to give them any reason to claim she was resisting. Not yet. Two other officers flanked her, leading her down the hallway. They weren't taking her to the interrogation room this time. Instead, they stopped at a door marked Processing, Secondary Intake. Inside, the room was stark, white tile floors, cinder block walls, and a metal table in the center. A camera sat in the far corner, its red light blinking, but Rebecca doubted it was recording. Holloway leaned against the table, arms crossed. Strip. Rebecca's jaw clenched. I said strip. Tate shifted uncomfortably behind Holloway. He was younger, still not fully consumed by the system, but he didn't speak up. He wouldn't. Rebecca stared at Holloway. For what reason? Routine search. His voice was casual, almost amused. Policy, Carter. You don't like it, take it up with the courts. She knew this wasn't about policy. This was about power, about breaking her down, about making sure she knew exactly where she stood. In their world. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she pulled her shirt over her head. The room was silent. Even Tate looked uncomfortable now. Rebecca moved with practiced control, keeping her expression blank as she removed each article of clothing. Holloway's smirk didn't fade. Turn around. Hands behind your head. Rebecca did as she was told. Her muscles coiled tight beneath her skin. See, that wasn't so hard, was it? Holloway said. He stepped closer. Rebecca's breath was slow, controlled. Her fingers twitched at the thought of snapping his wrist, of sending his face slamming into the metal table, of making him regret ever trying to humiliate her. Not yet. Holloway leaned in, his voice just for her. You think you're untouchable, but you're in my world now. And in my world, you don't get to be a hero. Rebecca turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. We'll see about that. Holloway lingered for a second longer before stepping back. Get dressed. She did, moving at her own pace, never breaking eye contact. As she pulled on her shirt, he clapped his hands together. See? We're learning. The door opened, and another officer entered, holding a tray of food. Breakfast, he said, setting it on the table. Rebecca's stomach tightened. The last thing she wanted was to accept anything from them, but she needed to stay sharp. She walked to the table, lifted the tray, and immediately noticed the officer's hesitation. Something was off. The food looked normal: scrambled eggs, toast, a small cup of juice. But Rebecca had learned to trust her instincts. She glanced at Tate, whose eyes flickered toward the juice for just a fraction of a second before looking away. That was enough. Rebecca picked up the juice, swirled it slightly, and set it down untouched. Instead, she took a bite of the toast, making sure they saw her eat something. Holloway watched her, waiting. When she didn't drink, his smirk faded slightly. Not thirsty, Carter? Rebecca smiled. I'll pass. Holloway exhaled through his nose, standing up straight. Suit yourself. They led her back to her cell. She could feel Tate's hesitation as he locked the door behind her. She sat on the cot, staring at the untouched cup of juice. What had they planned for her? Sedatives? A drug to make her seem unstable? Something worse? Across the hall, Linda, the older woman she had met the night before, was watching. You did good, she murmured. Rebecca glanced at her. They ever do that to you? Linda nodded. Seen it before. Some girls wake up feeling sick. Others don't wake up at all. Rebecca pressed her back against the wall, her mind racing. If they were willing to go this far, then they were scared. And scared men made mistakes. Meanwhile, across town, Judge Robert Ellis rubbed his temples as he read the latest message on his phone. She didn't take it. Ellis set his glass down, staring at the screen. Rebecca Carter was proving to be more of a problem than he had anticipated. With a sigh, he typed out his response. Then it's time to escalate. Rebecca Carter sat on the cold cot, staring at the untouched cup of juice. The fluorescent light above flickered every few seconds, buzzing like an insect trapped in glass. Sleep had been impossible. Every muscle in her body was tense, waiting for the next move. She had been in enough high-stakes situations to know that when the enemy's first plan failed, they always came back with something worse. The sound of keys rattling in the lock made her exhale slowly. She rolled her shoulders, preparing herself for whatever was coming next. Sergeant Holloway entered, flanked by two other officers. His smirk was wider today. Time for a little morning exercise, Carter, he said, his voice oozing amusement. Rebecca stood without hesitation. She wasn't going to give them an excuse to drag her out. The walk down the hallway felt longer today. The usual murmurs from other inmates were gone, replaced by a thick, uneasy silence. Even Linda, the older woman in the cell across from her, watched with a look of quiet concern. They led her into a different room this time. The concrete walls were bare. The only piece of furniture was a metal chair bolted to the floor. In the center, there were no cameras here. Holloway gestured toward the chair. Sit. Rebecca hesitated for half a second before complying. The metal was ice cold against her skin. Holloway paced in front of her, tapping his baton against his palm. You made quite the impression yesterday. Rebecca remained silent. No appetite, huh? He continued, circling her like a vulture. You think you're smart. Think you see through us. But let me tell you something, Carter. You don't run things in here. We do. Rebecca met his gaze, unflinching. If that were true, you wouldn't need to keep proving it. Holloway's jaw clenched. The baton slammed against the side of her chair, metal against metal, the sharp sound reverberating through the room. You're not special, he hissed. You're just another inmate. And inmates follow orders. Rebecca tilted her head slightly. Funny. I thought police officers followed the law. Holloway's face darkened. He nodded at the officer behind her. Pain exploded in her ribs as a fist drove into her side. Rebecca gritted her teeth, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She had been through worse. Much worse. Holloway crouched beside her, his voice almost gentle now. This is how it works, Carter. We can make your life easy, or we can make hell. All you have to do is cooperate. Say you resisted. Say you reached for Simmons' weapon. We'll cut you a deal, and you'll be out of here in a year. Maybe less. Rebecca exhaled slowly, ignoring the throbbing pain in her ribs. And if I don't, Holloway smiled. Then we take our time. Another blow to her ribs. This time, she felt the sharp sting of a bruise forming. She focused on her breathing, controlling the pain. I don't break, she said, voice steady. Holloway sighed, standing up. We'll see. The officers stepped back as he motioned toward the door. Take her back. They dragged Rebecca to her feet, pushing her forward. Every step sent a dull ache through her ribs, but she refused to stumble. Back in her cell, she sat on the cot, her breath slow and measured. Across from her, Linda watched with quiet understanding. They do that enough times, it'll start feeling normal, Linda said softly. Rebecca flexed her fingers, pressing against the soreness in her side. That's what they want. Linda nodded. You holding up? Rebecca exhaled. I've been through worse. Linda gave a knowing smile. Yeah, but worse don't make this any easier. Rebecca didn't answer. She was calculating, weighing her next move. They wanted to break her down, make her doubt herself, make her question if fighting back was worth it. It was. She just had to outlast them. Meanwhile, in a quiet office across town, Judge Robert Ellis sat behind his desk, scrolling through his phone. A new message flashed across the screen. She's still holding out. Ellis sighed, rubbing his temple. He had underestimated her. He thought the weight of the system would be enough to wear her down. Clearly, she was stronger than anticipated. Fine. He typed a response. If pain doesn't work, try isolation. Rebecca Carter had spent days in war zones, had been stranded behind enemy lines, had endured torture tactics designed to break even the strongest soldiers. Yet nothing compared to the slow, suffocating weight of isolation. She had sensed it coming. The moment she refused to break under Holloway's threats, the moment she didn't scream when his officers drove their fists into her ribs, she knew they would escalate. Now she sat alone in a windowless, concrete room barely bigger than a closet. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic, maybe rust, maybe dried blood. A single light flickered overhead, buzzing like an insect trapped behind glass. There was no cot, no blanket, just a metal bench bolted to the wall, and a hole in the floor that served as a toilet. Rebecca stretched her fingers, testing the stiffness in her knuckles. She wasn't sure how long she had been in here. They had taken her in the middle of the night, yanking her from her cell before Linda could even react. No explanation, no hearing, just silence. That was their next tactic. If pain didn't work, they would try deprivation. The slot at the bottom of the door slid open. A tray clattered against the concrete. Rebecca didn't move immediately. She had already learned that nothing they offered came without a hidden agenda. The tray held a scoop of something that might have once been mashed potatoes, a dry piece of bread, and a cup of water. She picked up the cup, swirling the liquid, studying it. No odor, no cloudiness. Still, she set it down. She could go days without food, longer without water if necessary. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of thinking they had control. The slot slammed shut. Rebecca exhaled slowly and leaned her head back against the wall, closing her eyes. She wouldn't break. Hours passed, maybe days. There was no clock, no sense of time. Only the unbearable silence, broken only by the occasional clang of metal against metal as the guards checked the door. Her body ached from sitting on the hard bench. Her ribs were still sore from the beating, but the pain had dulled into something manageable. She occupied herself the only way she knew how, mental drills. She went through combat sequences in her mind. Tactical maneuvers, weapon disassembly, the names of every person she had ever served with. She refused to let her mind turn to mush. The door finally opened. Sergeant Holloway stood there, arms crossed, looking down at her with a smug grin. "Still hanging in there, Carter?" Rebecca met his gaze but didn't answer. Holloway stepped into the cell, the door clanging shut behind him. "You're tougher than I expected. But see, here's the thing. You're not Navy anymore. You're not in some war zone where you've got a team backing you up. You're alone." Rebecca didn't flinch. Holloway crouched down to her level. "They already forgot about you. Your fancy military record doesn't mean shit in here. You're just another inmate now." Rebecca smiled slightly. "Then why are you working so hard to break me?" His smirk faltered. Rebecca leaned in just a fraction. "You're scared." Holloway's eyes darkened. He grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. "You think this is bad?" he whispered. "You think a couple of days in the hole is the worst we can do?" Rebecca's pulse stayed steady. "I think you're running out of options." Holloway let go, standing abruptly. He signaled to the guard outside. "Take her back," he ordered. 2 officers stepped in, yanking Rebecca to her feet. Her legs were stiff from sitting so long, but she didn't stumble. As they led her down the hall, she caught a glimpse of Linda through the bars of her old cell. The older woman's face was tight with concern. Rebecca gave her a small nod. She wasn't broken. Not yet. And if they thought solitary confinement would do it, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Meanwhile, in his office across town, Judge Robert Ellis leaned back in his chair, watching the rain streak down his window. A new message appeared on his phone. Still no progress. Ellis sighed, rubbing his temple. This was becoming a problem. He picked up his phone and dialed a number. When the voice on the other end answered, he spoke calmly, deliberately. "It's time to change the approach." Rebecca Carter had been back in the general population for less than a day when she felt the shift. Something had changed. The guards no longer bothered hiding their contempt. They shoved her harder, let their hands linger on their batons when she passed. Even the other inmates gave her wary glances, as if they knew something she didn't. Linda noticed too. As Rebecca sat down across from her in the cafeteria, tray in hand, the older woman studied her with a tight expression. "They got something planned for you," Linda murmured. "I can feel it." Rebecca had felt it too. She poked at the unappetizing pile of food on her tray, scanning the room casually. Sergeant Holloway stood near the exit, speaking to a guard. His voice was low, but his eyes flicked toward her more than once. She didn't need to hear the words to know he was setting something up. Rebecca took a slow sip of water and set the cup down. "Then I guess I'll be ready." Linda's expression darkened. "That's what worries me." Before Rebecca could respond, a tray clattered against the floor behind her. The cafeteria went silent. Rebecca turned just as a woman stepped. Toward her, a tall, muscular inmate with cold, empty eyes. The name stitched onto her jumpsuit read Conway. Rebecca had seen her before. A loyalist. The type of inmate who owed the guards favors. The type who did their dirty work when they wanted plausible deniability. Rebecca exhaled slowly. Conway smirked. "Heard you think you're tough." Rebecca didn't answer. Conway cracked her knuckles. "Guess we're about to find out." She lunged. Rebecca reacted instantly, twisting her body just as Conway's fist sailed past her head. She grabbed the woman's wrist, using her momentum to slam her face first into the cafeteria table. A sickening crunch followed as Conway let out a strangled curse. Blood dripped from her nose onto the plastic tray. Silence held for a beat. Then chaos erupted. Guards stormed forward, grabbing Rebecca and Conway, forcing them apart. "Carter, you're done." Holloway barked, striding toward her. "That's assault on another inmate." Rebecca kept her breathing steady, but she knew exactly what was coming next. Holloway leaned in, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "Back to solitary." The guards dragged her away, her feet barely touching the ground. Rebecca didn't fight, didn't resist. This had never been about Conway. This had been about giving them an excuse. And now they had won. Hours later, Rebecca sat in solitary once again. The room was just as cold, just as lifeless. But this time, she could feel the walls closing in just a little tighter. She leaned her head back, closing her eyes, replaying the fight in her mind. Conway had been sloppy. No real technique, no control. She had been sent to provoke, nothing more. Which meant they were running out of patience. Rebecca flexed her fingers, feeling the dull ache where she had struck Conway. She wasn't sure how much longer they would keep playing games before they escalated. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for what came next. Across town, Judge Robert Ellis sat in his dimly lit office, watching the message thread on his phone. She fought back. Ellis let out a slow breath. This was taking too long. He typed a response. Move to the next phase. Make her disappear. Rebecca Carter lay on the cold concrete floor of her solitary cell, her body stiff from the days she had spent in isolation. The single light overhead buzzed, flickering at irregular intervals, making it impossible to tell time. She had stopped counting the hours. That was part of the game. They wanted her disoriented. She refused to let them win. Her breathing remained steady. She visualized the faces of the men and women she had served with, the ones who had survived and the ones who hadn't. She focused on their names, their voices, their sacrifices. She wouldn't let these people break her. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, heavy, deliberate. The lock on her cell clicked, and the door creaked open. Sergeant Holloway stood in the doorway, his smirk as sharp as ever. Rise and shine, Carter. Rebecca didn't move right away. She sat up slowly, making a show of rolling out her stiff shoulders. What, no breakfast in bed? Holloway chuckled. You're funny. I'll miss that. Rebecca's eyes narrowed slightly. Miss it. Holloway stepped inside, two other guards flanking him. It's time for you to go. The way he said it made her skin crawl. Rebecca's mind ran through possibilities. This wasn't procedure. She had been isolated, beaten, and denied basic rights, but they had still followed some kind of system. This was different. She stood, stretching her arms slightly, as if the past week hadn't worn her down. Where to? Holloway's grin widened. Oh, you'll see. The two guards moved forward, yanking her arms behind her back and securing them with zip ties. They weren't even bothering with cuffs anymore. Rebecca let them. For now. They led her through the dimly lit corridors, avoiding the main walkways. No other prisoners in sight. No sounds except the rhythmic thud of their boots against concrete. They were moving her off the books. She glanced at the guard stances, the way their hands hovered near their batons and sidearms. They were tense. Good. Holloway finally stopped in front of a metal door. He swiped his keycard and held it open. After you. Rebecca stepped inside. The room was small, windowless, with a single chair bolted to the floor. A camera in the corner blinked red, but she knew better than to assume it was recording. Holloway stepped in behind her, shutting the door. Take a seat, he ordered. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. If I say no. Holloway grinned. Then we make you. Rebecca exhaled through her nose and sat. The moment she did, the guards moved in, securing her wrists and ankles to the chair. She tested the restraints. Tight. Hope you're comfortable, Holloway said, circling her like a predator. This is where it ends, Carter. Rebecca's jaw clenched, but she kept her expression neutral. So that's the plan? I just disappear. Holloway leaned in. You think anyone out there still cares? You're already off the roster. No lawyer. No trial. No record of your arrest. As far as the system is concerned, Rebecca Carter doesn't exist anymore. Rebecca's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. You're bluffing, she said. Holloway laughed. Am I? He pulled a folder from a nearby table and flipped it open. Inside were official documents, court records, booking sheets, mugshots, all stamped voided. Your lawyer. Holloway continued. Gone. Filed an official withdrawal this morning. Says you refuse counsel. The judge doesn't even remember your case. Funny how that works. Rebecca forced herself to stay calm. They were erasing her. Holloway tapped the folder. This is just the beginning. When we're done, there won't be a trace of you left. No fingerprints. No DNA. No history. You'll be just another name that got lost in the system." Rebecca tilted her head. "That's a lot of work just to make a Navy vet disappear." Holloway's smirk faltered for just a second. It was subtle, but she saw it. They weren't doing this just to get rid of her. They were covering something up. Rebecca leaned forward as much as the restraints allowed. "What are you so afraid of, Holloway?" His grin returned, but it was tighter now. "Doesn't matter," he said. "You won't be around to find out." He stood, signaling to the guards. "Move her." Rebecca steadied her breath. They hauled her to her feet and marched her down another hallway, deeper into the facility. The lighting grew dimmer, the air heavier. Then they reached another door. Holloway unlocked it and stepped aside. Rebecca stared into the darkness beyond. No windows, no sounds, just an empty void. "Enjoy the rest of your life, Carter," Holloway said. Then they shoved her inside. The door slammed shut, and the light disappeared. Darkness pressed in from all sides. Rebecca Carter kept her breathing steady as she adjusted to the pitch-black void they had thrown her into. There were no windows, no vent she could feel, no distant hum of an air conditioning unit. Just the sound of her own breath and the faint, metallic scent of the reinforced steel door behind her. This wasn't just solitary confinement. This was where they sent people to disappear. She reached out, feeling the cold concrete wall with her fingertips. Smooth. No cracks, no way to pry anything loose. She paced the small space, measuring her steps, mapping it in her head. It wasn't big, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet. Barely enough room to move. A slow, deliberate punishment. Her mind raced, piecing together everything Holloway had said. No lawyer, no records, no case. They weren't just covering up her arrest. They were erasing her from existence. But why? If this had been just another case of a corrupt cop abusing power, they would have let her rot in a regular cell. This was different. This was careful, methodical, which meant there was something bigger at play. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. Faint. Footsteps, distant voices, far away. No immediate guards outside. Good. She exhaled slowly. Holloway thought he had won. He thought she was trapped. He had no idea that he had just given her the most valuable thing she needed. Time. Across town, in a dimly lit bar, Daniel Hayes stared down at his whiskey glass, his hands trembling. He had done everything he could. Filed the motions. Contacted higher-ups. Demanded answers. And now it was all gone. The case. The files. Even Rebecca's name from the system. It was like she had never existed. His last attempt to visit her had been met with cold stares and a simple response from the warden. Who? Daniel swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the glass. They had warned him. A call in the middle of the night, an unmarked envelope on his desk filled with nothing but a single sentence. Walk away before you disappear too. His instincts told him to listen, to step back. But another voice, the one that had made him become a lawyer in the first place, refused to be silenced. He grabbed his phone and dialed the only number he had left. A low voice answered on the second ring. You shouldn't be calling me, Hayes. Daniel took a shaky breath. They erased her. A pause. Then, the voice on the other end sighed. Where are you? Daniel hesitated. Are you saying you'll help? I'm saying we don't talk on the phone. Meet me in 20 minutes. The line went dead. Daniel closed his eyes, exhaled sharply, and grabbed his coat. If Rebecca still had a chance, he wasn't going to let her fight alone. Back in the darkness of her cell, Rebecca crouched, running her hands along the bottom of the door. If they had taken her off the record, that meant someone had pulled serious strings to make it happen. And someone that powerful always made mistakes. She just needed to find one. Her fingers brushed against something rough near the base of the door. Small, barely noticeable, a worn-down edge in the metal. It wasn't much, but it was something. She smirked. Holloway had made one fatal error. He had underestimated her, and that was going to cost him everything. The first crack in the system was always the hardest to find. But once you saw it, once you felt it, you could bring the whole damn thing down. Rebecca Carter ran her fingers over the jagged edge at the bottom of the door. A weak point. Small but enough. Enough to exploit. Enough to make them regret ever thinking she was just another prisoner they could disappear. She wasn't trapped in here with them. They were trapped in here with her. She pulled back, her mind working at a relentless pace. If the door had flaws, the rest of the facility might too. They had gotten comfortable, so sure of their control that they didn't bother maintaining the very walls they used to contain her. But she still needed time. She sat back against the cold wall and slowed her breathing. Conservation. Control. She wouldn't waste her strength. Not yet. Her chance was coming. It always did. Daniel Hayes' heart pounded as he pulled into the darkened parking lot of an abandoned warehouse. The man waiting for him was already there, standing just outside the glow of the street lamp. David Hall, a former investigator, a man who had once been part of the same system that had swallowed Rebecca whole. Daniel stepped out of the car. "Tell me you found something." Hall exhaled, rubbing a hand over his stubbled jaw. "More than something." He pulled out a manila folder and handed it over. They didn't just erase her. They buried her under a mountain of falsified paperwork. They marked her as deceased. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. What? She's dead officially. Signed off by a medical examiner who, surprise, surprise, doesn't actually exist. Hall crossed his arms. They didn't just scrub her name from the system. Hayes. They killed her on paper. Daniel flipped through the pages, bile rising in his throat. If they were willing to go this far, then Rebecca wasn't just an inconvenience to them. She was a threat. Hall's voice dropped lower. They're moving her. Daniel's head snapped up. When? Tonight. Panic surged through him. Where? Hall shook his head. I don't know. But if they're moving her now, that means they're done playing games. Wherever she's going, she's not coming back. Daniel's grip tightened on the folder. Then there was no time left. They had to move now. Rebecca heard them before she saw them. The footsteps. The shift in the air. The way the floor vibrated slightly as something heavy rolled past her cell. They were coming. Her heartbeat stayed steady, but her mind sharpened like a blade. No hesitation. No fear. They thought they were ending this tonight. They had no idea she was just getting started. The door unlocked with a metallic groan. Sergeant Holloway stepped in, his usual smirk in place, but his eyes held something new this time. Something nervous. Time's up, Carter, he said. Let's go. Rebecca slowly got to her feet, rolling out her shoulders like she was just waking up from a nap. She didn't fight when the guards moved in, grabbing her arms, securing the zip ties tighter than necessary. She didn't need to fight. Not yet. They led her through the dimly lit hallway, past cells filled with inmates who barely stirred. It was late, past midnight maybe, the perfect time to make someone disappear. Holloway walked beside her, a smug satisfaction in his stride. You know, he said, keeping his voice casual, I almost admire your resilience. Rebecca didn't react. He chuckled. But you had to push, didn't you? Had to keep fighting. They turned a corner. The hall ended at a heavy steel door, the kind meant for loading docks. An exit, a transfer, or an execution. Holloway leaned in slightly. I told you before, Carter. You're nothing now. No name, no records, no one looking for you. He smiled. Once you go through that door, you're gone. Rebecca held his gaze, steady and unshaken. Then, for the first time since this started, she smiled. Holloway's smirk faltered. Then the lights cut out. A deep, rumbling explosion rocked the facility. The guards froze. Holloway's head snapped toward the door just as the alarms blared to life. Rebecca moved. She twisted, slamming her knee into the closest guard's stomach. He staggered, and before he could react, she hooked her zip-tied wrists over his head, using the momentum to flip over him, breaking the plastic restraints in the process. The second guard fumbled for his baton, but Rebecca was faster. She drove an elbow into his jaw, sending him sprawling. Holloway stumbled backward, reaching for his gun. Rebecca lunged. Her fist connected with his ribs, knocking the air from his lungs. He gasped, but before he could recover, she grabbed the back of his head and slammed it into the metal door. He crumpled. Rebecca exhaled, shaking out her hands. The alarm still screamed. Red emergency lights flickered overhead. She turned toward the now unlocked exit door and stepped through. The cool night air hit her like a shock to the system. Two black SUVs sat idling in the parking lot. One of the doors flew open. Daniel Hayes stood there, breathless, eyes wide. Rebecca. She didn't stop, didn't hesitate. She ran toward freedom, toward the truth, and toward the reckoning that was about to come. Rebecca Carter had spent her life in war zones, but nothing compared to the battlefield she was stepping onto now. The city skyline blurred past the SUV's tinted windows as they sped through the empty streets. Daniel Hayes sat in the driver's seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. David Hall sat in the back, rapidly typing on a laptop, his face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. "They're scrambling," Hall muttered. As soon as that explosion hit, all secure channels went dark. "Someone's trying to wipe the last of the evidence." Rebecca exhaled sharply. "Then we don't have much time." She glanced down at herself. She was still in the prison-issued jumpsuit, bruises blooming along her ribs from days of beatings. But none of that mattered now. They had tried to erase her. Now she was going to erase them, one by one. Robert Ellis sat in his office, drinking scotch like it would slow his racing pulse. The news was everywhere. The incident at the detention center. The prisoner escapes. And worst of all, the leak files. Rebecca Carter wasn't a missing inmate anymore. She was alive. And now the entire world knew. His phone buzzed. He hesitated, then picked it up. "Tell me you handled it." A shaky breath on the other end. "Holloway." "She's gone," Holloway said, voice raw. "She took out half my men." Ellis gritted his teeth. "Then you find her. Now." Silence. Then a knock at the office door. Ellis froze. The knock came again. Slow. Deliberate. His stomach twisted. No one should have been able to get past security. He reached for the drawer where he kept his gun, but before his fingers could close around the handle, the door burst open. Rebecca stood there. She wasn't a prisoner anymore. She wasn't someone they could erase. She was judgmental. Ellis barely had time to stand before she crossed the room in 3 strides, grabbing him by the collar and slamming him onto his desk. The glass of scotch shattered, the amber liquid spreading like blood. "Carter," he gasped. She twisted his arm behind his back until he screamed. "You tried to make me disappear," she said, voice calm, deadly. "How does it feel, Judge, knowing that in a few minutes you're going to be the one who's forgotten?" His breath hitched. You can't." She grabbed his phone and held it up. The screen showed a live stream, news anchors discussing the leaked documents, his signature on falsified reports, his offshore accounts, the names of the people he had buried under false convictions. It was over. Rebecca leaned in. "The FBI is on their way. I hope you have a good defense attorney, Judge, because I hear the system isn't very kind to people like you." Ellis snapped. With a desperate growl, he lunged for the drawer again, going for his gun. But Rebecca was faster. She grabbed the scotch bottle and brought it down hard against his skull. Ellis collapsed. Blood trickled down his temple. He groaned, dazed, barely conscious. Rebecca didn't look back. She walked out the door. Across town, Holloway's luck ran out. He had barely made it to his safe house when the lights flooded the room, blinding, white-hot spotlights cutting through the darkness. The deafening shout came next. "FBI, hands where we can see them." Holloway barely had time to reach for his weapon before the door exploded inward. Agents swarmed the room, tackling him to the ground. Cold steel clamped around his wrists. The last thing he saw before his face hit the floor was David Hall, standing at the doorway, arms crossed, watching. "Hey, Holloway," Hall said with a smirk. "Welcome to the system you helped create." Holloway screamed. No one cared. The sun was rising when Rebecca stood on the courthouse steps, looking out at the city. She was free. But more than that, she had won. Daniel stepped beside her, his face weary but triumphant. "It's over," he said. Rebecca nodded. For now. She had spent her whole life fighting, and she wasn't done yet. She turned to face the cameras as reporters swarmed forward, microphones thrust toward her. "Rebecca, do you have a statement?" She met their eyes, her voice steady, unshaken. "They tried to bury me," she said. She took a breath. "But they forgot. I was a soldier first." And just like that, Rebecca Carter walked into history, unbroken, undefeated, and ready for whatever came next. The end. This isn't just Rebecca's fight. How many others have been silenced? How many more are still waiting for their truth to be heard? Now I want to hear from you. What do you think? Did they get what they deserved? Drop a comment below and tell me your thoughts. If you love stories where the underdog fights back and wins, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's coming next. Because trust me, there's always more to uncover.